Okay, so we're going to talk about content analysis. Content analysis is another method of investigation. Lots of different methods of investigation, research methods we call them, that we're going to cover, and you need to know for the exam. You'll be covering fairly soon an experiment. I know you know a little bit about that. We've already talked about case studies. You have referred to experiments. Content analysis is another form of investigation. Okay, so it's a non-experimental form of investigation. So what is it? It's a type of observation which is carried out on communication. Okay, lots of different types of communication. So for example, advertisements are forms of communication. Conversations, as we know, books, magazines, and so on and so forth. So lots of different types of communication, and this is observing them. And what we do is we code them in terms of what we call here predetermined categories, things we've set out to investigate, and then we analyse them. And I'll talk about the method in a moment. So it does identify an IV, an independent variable, but unlike an experiment, it doesn't manipulate it. So the experiment is the one place where you manipulate an IV to see its effect on the DV. With a content analysis, we're not doing that. We're just observing a particular independent variable. And it observes naturally occurring events, so adverts and different communication, as I've already said. And those who carry out the content analysis will identify certain variables and what we call operationalize. All we mean by this is putting those variables into measurable form. So it's quite a fancy way. Operationalize, you operationalize. It just means that you put them into measurable form. I should say here, guys, that I'm actually going to use one of your names. I just want to see how much of this you actually hear, and and see whether you're all actually going to cover this. So I'm going to put somebody's name in this, and I'd like at some point, I'm just going to say the name of one of the people in one of the groups, and I just want you to make a note of that. So when we come into the lesson, just be discreet, okay? Because obviously it'll show who has actually done this prep, okay? So I'm quite interested to see. So where are we up to? We are going to talk about this, the procedure. So what do they actually do? What is the procedure? I move this up a little bit. Okay, so the procedure is that they set out a predetermined coding system. All right, so they look at the advert coding system with, for example, finding out categories like whether it's a male or female voiceover. With the advert that we've looked at, whether the male or the female has the key role in that, whether they're seen as active or passive, things like that. So that's what we mean by this little coding system. And when I've got here, look at our advert coding system with male, female voiceover. So I'm referring to the one that we did in class. Okay, so look at that. That shows you what I mean by this predetermined coding system. And then, of course, if you were doing this like you did in class, you would observe the communication. You watch the advert or you listen to the conversation or whatever. Okay, and you analyze the content of that. Usually exactly as we did by ticking boxes for whichever category it fits into. All right, so some sort of coding system like that. So usually something like a tick box is a nice, easy way of doing it. And then all you do is you count the frequency, count the number of those specific behaviours, as we did in class. So that if they ask you the procedure, how would we actually do a content analysis, you need to refer to these sort of terms: predetermined coding system, you observe it, you analyse the content, and you count the frequency of specific behaviours. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, those steps you need to say. Okay, so we're about halfway down, just checking, and the name I'm going to mention is Jack. Okay, so the advantage here. What's so great about this? Well, first of all, it converts qualitative data into quantitative data. So qualitative data is more in-depth, a better understanding, gives you data that has a better understanding of the material. And quantitative is data that has numbers, basically. All right. So what we're doing here is we're taking something that isn't numerical, like an advert, and we're actually converting it in some way to quantitative. And that can be advantageous because we can have a look and we can make comparisons then with other data. How many times was the male the main part, had the main role in an advert, for example. How many times was the voiceover female, things like that. How many times is the main character female, male, whatever. That gives us quantitative data. The other advantage is it does give us very high ecological validity. I've said that wrong, sorry. Highly ecological data. It has high ecological validity, all right? Because if you remember that, these are real conversations, they're real books, they're real adverts, they're real magazines that you're looking at. And therefore, they exist in the world, and therefore that means it has very high, highly ecologically valid material. Sorry, getting in a muddle with my words there. Okay, so how does this relate to gender? So this is just a research method. We will need to just cover that again when we do research methods very briefly. But we also need to know it in terms of gender. It's relevant in terms of gender. So how is it related to gender? Right, well, from the gender perspective, it might be that we look at the differences in ways that, for example, parents will speak to boys and girls. Actually, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we do speak differently to our boys and girls. But what's important, do those different words mean that we're influencing them either directly or even indirectly? So, for example, if parents are using specific words, vocabulary with their boys and not with their girls, is that going to influence the way the children learn their own language? Or does it also influence the way they view the world because they're being treated differently in terms of the way they're spoken to, etc., etc.? Okay, I want you to look in now at your textbook, page 51, and I want you to talk about, first of all, what's the aim of the study? All right, what were they actually investigating? What were they trying to do? Be careful with the second one. When were the TV adverts collected? I don't want you to just say the year. I think it was something like 2000. It's not that I'm after. It's when in the day, for example, and over what period of time. How many adverts were looked at? What were the categories they were investigating? So in other words, how did they operationalize those categories? We had male voiceover, male or female voiceover. We had who was active, passive. What did they do? What were they specifically looking for? What were the results in terms of just these three categories? Okay, don't worry about the rest. That will be enough. And what was the conclusion? So there were various problems, and actually these are really often problems with content analysis as a whole. So here there's a little bit about the two coders. All right, they had two people investigating this. We call them coders, and actually they disagreed sometimes, and that's one of the problems, that it's not always going to be straightforward about, for example, who's more active or passive. And you may have already an idea, you might have a biased view already. So if this was about somebody who felt very strongly that adverts were very male dominated with voiceovers and things like that, and that the female roles were always very passive, they may already have a fixed view on that, and therefore they're going to look at that advert and judge that a female is passive, perhaps. Right, so there is bias in it. They're not always going to agree, and there might be bias, like any observation. And we call that observer bias. So you guys, if you're listening, you put that in. There may be observer bias with it. Okay. The other thing is, of course, is people are not always going to be influenced by the messages. So they may perceive adverts differently. And again, maybe they just passively respond to them, or maybe they don't passively respond to them and they actually question them. I remember watching an advert, a ridiculous advert it happens to be, of some time ago, a few years ago, and I think it was advertising the train line or something like that. And what they had was a woman in a bikini standing at the front of the train, and it was just so irrelevant and so ridiculous that obviously it grabbed my attention, because I was kind of outraged about why they needed that person at the front and what the message was. It was bizarre. So, people don't always passively respond to adverts. They may feel that they want to question a little bit more, or they're annoyed by it, or whatever. Okay, so there are problems with these. All right, so that's that.